What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today I have a little bit of an impromptu video that I'm going to be putting out for you, and this one kind of spawned from a different idea that I came up with, considering the fact that preseason is just around the corner for the NHL and the season is going to start before we know it. So when I was going through this video idea, making my power rankings for the upcoming season, there were a lot of teams that I felt like I was sort of uncertain about where I wanted to put them in my power rankings. These are teams that I feel like have really no direction at the moment, whether they're trying to rebuild or if they're trying to be a serious contender. And I thought it would be an interesting idea to talk about these teams and whether or not they're going to be capable of actually doing something this upcoming season, or if they should just speed up the rebuild that seems inevitable. Now, there's a handful of these that I really had a hard time ranking, so we're going to go through each one today, giving you guys a bit of an analysis on what I think each of them should do. So if you guys have been enjoying the content lately and you want to subscribe to the channel, make sure you do that now to let you know whenever I post fun new content like this. And let's get right into this one. So let's start with the most interesting team of this bunch, and that's the Pittsburgh Penguins. Now, the reason I find the Penguins so interesting is because they still have some talent that's capable of actually doing damage if they could get into the postseason, but the fact is they can't get into the postseason because the supporting cast just isn't good enough. Crosby is still playing at an elite level. Erik Karlsson and Chris Letang, they definitely have enough in the tank to maybe support a solid blue line, but it's really not scaring any of their opponents. Evgeny Malkin's fall off has been pretty significant, and like I said, the supporting cast, it's pretty lackluster, despite the additions of Rutger McGroarty, which was a great trade, and Kevin Hayes. I don't think that this lineup is terrible. I just think that it's not going to be capable of getting the Penguins into the postseason because of all of the other competition they'll have to beat out in the East. I like this team. I do like their superstars, and I still think that they could be a dangerous competitor if they get into the postseason. But outside of Crosby, I just don't think they have enough talent or elite playmakers to really do any damage, like I said, in this conference. So for me, I think that the best route for the Penguins would be to trade off of these players while they still have a little bit of value, especially Crosby. I know that he's a fan favorite, he's a legend for the organization, but at this point, I just don't think you're going to be able to surround him with enough players or talent to really get him to that point where he wants to be if he still wants to compete for championships. I could see the Penguins potentially getting into the postseason this year, but in my opinion, I just don't think it's going to happen. I think that they should rebuild. That's the direction they need to head into. Like I said, a lot of these directionless teams, it just feels confusing, but for the Penguins, it feels like that's the best path for them. Up next, you really don't have to look far for this team. Pretty similar to the Pittsburgh Penguins. In fact, they're in the same division. It's the Washington Capitals. Now, the only thing about the Washington Capitals that's different from the Pittsburgh Penguins is the fact that Alex Ovechkin has fallen off significantly compared to Sidney Crosby. But the one thing the Capitals do have over the Penguins is, one, the fact that they made the playoffs last year, and two, the fact that they actually built a little bit of a better roster around Ovechkin this year compared to Pittsburgh. Now, looking at some of the offseason additions that they made, acquiring Pierre-Luc Dubois, Andrew Mangiapane, Logan Thompson, Jacob Chychrun, just a bunch of, I guess you could say, middle of the pack guys that could make a little bit of an impact, but really won't thread the needle much for the Caps. It's all basically just some depth moves. And with them being an aging roster as well, it just feels like they're prolonging the inevitable in the exact same way as the Penguins, trying to hold on to their legendary players before trading them for assets that could really help reset the franchise. Now, people are pretty high on the Washington Capitals this year, but I actually disagree a lot. I feel like this team is basically the same on paper, with a few nice additions that could maybe bump them up a point or two in the standings, but with how the competition improved this offseason, I see them actually falling in the standings, not going up. I like Alex Ovechkin, of course, but if injury was the reason he was playing bad last year, maybe I could see them being a bit better, but I don't think that that's the case. I think that this is just a natural regression from a player who's getting older. The Capitals are fine, but they do feel directionless. Like I said, the Penguins, they need to sell these assets to reset their franchise, and I feel the same way about the Capitals. Now, they could prove me wrong. Maybe these offseason additions will really change a lot about the organization, but I think it's about time for them to hit the reset button. Get rid of all of these nice assets that have been so great for you throughout your franchise's history. Of course, they're not going to do that because they want Ovechkin to break the record with them, but that's what I really think that the Capitals should do, especially if this season ends up being a failure. Next up, let's shift over to the Western Conference for a minute and actually focus on the Central Division with the St. Louis Blues. Now, I think a lot of people could see this one coming. The Blues have felt a little bit directionless since their cup run back in 2019. It's not that this team isn't solid or they couldn't potentially make the playoffs if everything goes right, but I just feel like when I hear hear St. Louis Blues, I hear the word mid. They're a very middle of the pack team. They have some nice talented players, but no star that's really going to thread the needle, and a defense that's very lackluster, especially with one of their better guys being put on IR for an injury that's most likely going to keep him out for the entire season in Torrey Krug. Now, they were just trying to dish this player off to Philadelphia a few years ago, which kind of shows you the state of their defensive lines right now. But taking a look at their roster, their top line and second line, it's fine. Has a few guys who have been inconsistent, like Jordan Kyrou, Brandon Saad getting a little bit older, and outside of Buchnevich and Thomas, I just feel like there really isn't enough going for this team to really consider them to be a threat in the West at all. I like the Blues. I like some of their players, especially Robert Thomas. I think he's an absolute stud and one of the more underrated guys in the league. But when I look at this blue line, Nick Leddy, Colton Parayko, Broberg, Falk, I just don't really see enough here. And now they add Ryan Suter. That was their only answer to Torrey Krug being out, which again feels like in a subtraction by addition in a weird way, if that's even a saying. I do think that Jordan Binnington had a very nice year, all things considered, getting himself kind of in the Vezina conversations a little bit with one of his better performing years since the Cup run as well. But outside of that, I just don't really know what the Blues are trying to do at this point. The thing about the Blues, though, is I do think that they probably shouldn't rebuild. I feel like they could continue retooling or maybe trade some of these guys a little bit to get some better assets. Maybe that time was a couple of years ago when they were getting rid of O'Reilly and Tarasenko, but I still feel like they have enough of a prospect system as well as enough players on this team that they could move around a few pieces and potentially be back in the playoffs in more of a 2 to 3 year timeline as opposed to the Penguins and Capitals. That is going to feel like a bit of a longer one, more like 5 to 7 years if they end up blowing everything up. I like the Blues. Like I said, they have some nice pieces on this roster, but if they want to continue down this directionless path, they're really going to get nowhere. They have those good players, but they could build around this team a little bit better and potentially get themselves back into a rotation of playoff teams if they just make a few adjustments. So that's what I think they should do. I think they should continue retooling, but be a little bit more aggressive with it, trying to acquire a few more stars to put around guys like Thomas and Buchnevich. Next up, let's stay in the Western Conference, but shift over to the Pacific Division and focus specifically on the Seattle Kraken. Now, the thing with the Kraken is I feel like they got a lot of flack for not living up to the same hype that Vegas had put out there in their inaugural season, but then followed it up with a pretty promising playoff run, beating the previous Stanley Cup champions in the Colorado Avalanche until eventually fizzling out in the later rounds. Now, this past season was definitely a step back for this team, but I still feel like they're sort of directionless. I like the spunk that some of their players have, but I don't feel like it's enough to really make them a competitor this year, especially when the Pacific Division has some real powerhouse teams at the top. Now, looking at their roster, I like McCann. I don't think he's a bona fide superstar, but I do think that he's capable of being a top-line winger in this league. I also think that Matty Beniers has a ton of potential, but outside of that, I just see an aging roster that doesn't have this high-end ceiling, but just kind of this minimum floor where they're going to be either a wild card team or just miss the playoffs. Their defense is very underwhelming. Even with the addition of Brandon Montour, I feel like it just lacks a little bit of talent, and I do think that Montour deal is a bit of an overpay. And same goes for Stevenson. I feel like their offseason acquisitions were a little bit desperate, and they were trying to put something out there to show that they're not giving up on this current roster. Like I said, they have some nice young players. Matty Beniers has been very solid for them even after that sophomore slump. Joey Dackert is a surprise in net, but some of their other prospects like Shane Wright, they're looking more and more like busts every day than they are the players that we all thought they could potentially be. I don't know with Seattle. I don't know if they should rebuild. I don't know if they should try to go more in with this roster. I do like them being a little bit aggressive at the offseason, but I don't really like the moves that they made. It didn't impress me at all. I think at this point, I would still invest a little bit more into this team before I fully went into a rebuild stage. Your players are young enough that you can do that. Maybe you could retool on the fly similar to the Blues and kind of put out a better team that is capable of competing in the playoffs like you were a couple of seasons back, but I just don't think that it's necessary to do a full rebuild right now. Just feels a little bit directionless in my opinion. So I think similar to the Blues, they should retool a little bit more because this current roster, it's just not all that impressive, but it still could be capable of doing something if they can get into the postseason. And last but not least, we're going to stay in the Western Conference, but head back to the Central Division to focus on the Minnesota Wild. Now, the thing with the Wild is they're a little bit different from other teams on this list because I feel like they've been drafting pretty well over the past couple of years, getting Kirill Kaprizov, Matt Boldy, Marco Rossi, Brock Faber, and then adding guys like Philip Gustafsson in net who have a lot of potential. I feel like it's a solid core for them to build around, but the only issue is that their cap restrictions have really held held them back. And a lot of these guys who are on some pretty team-friendly deals are now going to sign these big contracts that will prevent them from adding players that could make them a serious contender in the playoffs. Kirill Kaprizov is on a pretty big deal right now. Brock Faber just signed to a big deal, and others are soon to come. That's just the reality of the NHL. So I feel like their window of capitalizing on those rookie deals or just early entry contracts is going to be ending soon. And unfortunately, Minnesota just couldn't capitalize on that. And that's kind of a sad thing for this team and what makes them so directionless. Now, I like Minnesota and what they're building, and I do think that they have the most potential from all of the teams on this list. But let's be honest, if they can't get one or two more players on this team, add some significant depth to their defense, I feel like this is basically their ceiling of being a wildcard team or a potential first round exit. I would like to see Minnesota succeed though. I love a lot of their players and I think they're an incredibly underrated team and organization, but I do feel like at this moment they're sort of directionless, and I would like to see those cap restrictions get removed so I could see what we potentially have with this roster. I think that they should continue building like they have been over the past couple of seasons. Like I said, they've done a great job with their drafting and development. I don't think they should rebuild at all, but I do think they need to go a little bit more all in once those restrictions are removed, so that way they can see what they actually have with this team and potentially get themselves back into contention for things. But this is my list for sort of the directionless teams in the NHL over the next couple of seasons. Drop your thoughts in the comments below what you think a lot of these teams should do moving forward, if you think they should rebuild or continue to kind of retool and push for playoff contention based on either the age of their rosters or just the potential that they have. Like I said, drop your thoughts in the comments below. Make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel for more content. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one.